Howdy, y'all. Namaste, and welcome back to the next stop, the next point of interest, I guess you could say, on this ongoing philosophical quest. Today, we're all the way up to chapter 11, and chapter 11 I'm calling Out of Place, which is a term that I'm taking from this text that we're studying today, which is Plato's Phaedrus dialogue. And I gotta say, I'm a little bit nervous. I mean, I'm always nervous when the camera goes on, I hit record and that sort of thing. But I'm especially nervous today because of this text. And the reason I'm nervous about it is because I love this text. This is one of my absolute favorite texts in the world. It's one of my absolute favorite texts to study, to read, and especially to teach and talk about. So I'm a little bit nervous because I want to share the same enthusiasm that I have for it, and I want that enthusiasm to infect you as well, right? To be passed on to you, to inspire you. And inspiration is a lot of what we're talking about today in this text, and especially through this whole little unit. We're going to study this text over a few chapters, as well as I'll say in a minute. But today's just kind of giving an overview. We're going to talk about the text as a whole and what to expect from it and what we're really trying to get out of it. So got a lot to cover, so I want to get right to it. But first, quick little story / disclaimer. So I've been studying this text for at least 15 years. Hard to know. Hard to remember exactly when I started studying it, but I know that I studied it intensely when I was at Harvard. And so in the third year of doctoral studies, you have to do what's called comprehensive exams, and it was nice, honestly, because I had a whole year where I was just paid basically to study. So all I did was study and read and that kind of stuff. But then the end of that year, you've got a series of exams, 4 exams over 10 days, each one 4 hours long, very intense, very exhausting. And then 2 weeks after that, you have an oral defense where you have to defend all the stuff that you wrote. And I wrote a lot. I wrote 120 pages during my comprehensive exams. Had a lot to defend, and I remember after my defense, which I got to say was really not fun, but it was definitely one of the worst things I've been through. But I made it through, and I think that grueling aspect is part of the hazing process or whatever that is doctoral studies. Anyway, one of the professors, a mentor, came up to me, who's quite an expert in the Platonic texts and the Platonic dialogues and that sort of thing. And he came up to me and he put his arm around me, and it was intended, it was well intended and that sort of thing. It was a little awkward though because we're the same age, so he's a mentor and a professor, but also the age. Anyway, he came up to me and he said, Brad, you want to be careful. You don't want to get a reputation for being idiosyncratic. And you know what I said? Nothing, because I didn't know what the word idiosyncratic meant. So I just kind of nodded, yes, sir. And then as soon as he walked away, I pull out my phone and look up, well, what does idiosyncratic mean? Looked up idiosyncratic. Turns out it means somebody who's outside of the box, like somebody who doesn't think the same way that other people do. Somebody who comes at, who's out of sync with everybody else, who thinks outside of the box. And I was like, hell yeah, I want to be an idiosyncratic. That's exactly who I am, right? That's me to a T. So I don't know, I guess disclaimer. So you're learning it from an idiosyncratic thinker. So take it for what it is. But with that in mind, let's dig into this text, because idiosyncratic or not, I love this text. Fucking love this text. It's great. And I hope that you enjoy what we're doing too. So I want to first give you a little bit of overview of the structure of the text. So the structure of the text is important and significant here, and interesting. So Plato wrote this dialogue sometime around 370 BCE, so about 30 years after Socrates died. It's a fiction. It's not maybe this dialogue happened, maybe it didn't. Well, this dialogue didn't happen. Maybe they had a conversation, maybe they didn't. But what we have here is, a creation of Plato. So Plato wrote this 30 years after Socrates was gone, after he'd been murdered by the government. And let's just look at the structure of it, right? So it's in 2 halves. And so the first half, we've got Preamble. And in this Preamble, lots of important stuff happens in this Preamble. We're going to kind of look closely at the Preamble in this lecture today. Lots of stuff happens there. First of all, Socrates follows Phaedrus. Phaedrus leads Socrates out of the city. This is an unusual text in a number of ways. It's idiosyncratic in Plato's discourse because it's the only dialogue that only has two main dialogue partners in it, only two people in the dialogue, Phaedrus and Socrates. It's also unusual because it takes place outside of the city. It takes place in nature. In fact, nature, and in many ways, as we'll see, is another sort of character in this dialogue. And there's also this other guy, Lysias, who's kind of off stage. He's also an important character in the dialogue, but he's off stage. So Socrates follows Phaedrus outside of the city. Right at the beginning, in 230e, Socrates says, just as people lead hungry animals away by shaking branches of fruit before them, you can lead me all over Attica or anywhere else you like, simply by waving in front of me the leaves of a book containing a speech. In other words, if you know what somebody desires, if you know what they want more than anything else, if you know what somebody desires, you can control them. Right? You can dangle what they want in front of them and lead them wherever you want to go, right? It gives you a certain power over that other person. So that's an important point. Then in 229 to 230, some paragraphs later, Socrates talks about the important relationship between mythic legends and philosophy. So in short, he says that mythic stories help us to know ourselves, right? The Delphic oracle said to Socrates, you must know thyself, right? Know thyself. That anthropology, right? Who am I? Who are we? This text helps us to do that. That helps us to, if we understand ourselves and what we desire, then we can control that, and that prevents us to a certain extent from other people being able to control us, right? So knowing ourselves makes us more independent and more in control of ourselves. So that happens, the preamble. And then what happens next is Phaedrus reads a speech that was written by Lysias. We'll talk about who these people are in a minute. But right now the point is Phaedrus reads a text that was written by somebody else, right? And so he delivers this speech. Socrates lays down the grass and he listens and he listens. Phaedrus gives this very impassioned reading of the speech, and then afterwards he says, all right, what'd you think, Socrates? And Socrates is like, you did fantastic. You did an awesome job. Well done. Really great. Good job reading that text. I could feel your enthusiasm. I could feel you were really into it, right? I was right there with you. I felt your passion for it. And Phaedrus is like, yeah, but what'd you think about the speech? Wasn't the speech itself awesome? And Socrates is like, well, I wouldn't go that far, right? Actually, the speech kind of sucked. I didn't think that it was very good at all. He said, in fact, I think I could do a better speech on the same topic right now, just off the cuff, right? I mean, I don't think Lysias must have spent very much time on it. And Phaedrus is like, dude, why don't you do that, right? Why don't you give a speech right now on the same topic? And Socrates is like, all right, fine, I'll do that. But you know what I'm gonna do? He said, I'm gonna cover my head, right? I'm gonna take a cloth and I'm gonna cover my head and I'm gonna give my speech. Weird thing to do, right? So we'll look at that a little bit later.
Just give your speech. You can do anything else you like.
Come to me, you clear-voiced muses, whether you are called so because of the quality of your song. What he means with his head covered, why is his head covered? But more important than that right now is the fact that this speech was inspired by Phaedrus. It was also kind of inspired by nature, inspired by the birds and the bees, and especially the cicadas. There's also kind of a character in this text. Then Socrates stops like halfway through the speech. And it's an important speech. There's so much good stuff in here. In this speech, first of all, in Phaedrus' speech, the main point of the speech that Phaedrus reads that was written by Lysias, he says that erotic desire, it's about Eros, erotic desire, same thing we studied in chapter 9, right? In between Lost and Found, that discourse between Socrates and his teacher, Diotima, which is on erotic desire. And we've talked about that a lot, the ladder of desire and all those kind of things. The important role that desire plays in making decisions, right? The intellectual philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect through cultivating a desire for wisdom through inspiration. So this is the text where we're talking about inspiration, right? But Phaedrus gives that, he has a different perspective on erotic desire. And he describes erotic desire as a kind of sickness, right? That a person who is filled with desire is kind of sick or mad, right? They can't think straight. They're not in control of themselves. And so they need to like satisfy or cure that desire, get rid of it, so that they can focus on more important things, right? If you're hungry, eat some food. If you're thirsty, drink some water. If you're horny, get freaky, right? Then you can focus on whatever thing it is that you've got to do. Now, in Socrates' speech, when he gives that inspired speech, right, with his head covered, he kind of takes up that same notion, right? Okay, let's go with that logic that erotic desire is some kind of sickness, right? But he gives a number of other things in that speech. He says, he tells Phaedrus how to make a good decision on any topic and talks about the logic of making a decision. You got to be clear about what this particular decision is about, right? And maybe it turns out the decision is about whether or not erotic desire is something bad. Then he says each of us is driven by two forces which we follow wherever they lead. One is our inborn desire for pleasure, and the other is our acquired judgment or intellect, right? Being able to control, make good decisions, right? And sometimes we go with sometimes we choose what is best, and sometimes we follow our desires, right? And sometimes they're in harmony, sometimes they conflict with one another. So these are some of the important things that come from that particular speech. After he gives it, right, and then he stops halfway in between, halfway in the middle of his speech, he stops talking. And Phaedrus is like, dude, why'd you stop? Like, it was good. Seems like you were just getting going, right? All this good stuff. I was right in there with you, and then all of a sudden you stopped. It wasn't over. And Socrates says, man, I realized that speech was horrible. I'm embarrassed by that speech. I feel like it was horrible. He said, the only thing worse than the speech that I just gave is the speech that you read, that Lysias wrote, right? That one was worse. So if my speech has anything going for it, it's the fact that it was better than Lysias' speech, right? But both of them were just horrible. And he said, I'm embarrassed by it. In fact, I have to atone for my sin. He calls it blasphemy. The speech was blasphemous, right? An offense against God. And he says, I've got to make up for that. I've got to give a palinode. I've got to make an ode to desire, an ode to Eros, to try and make up for the sin of that first speech, where I'm blaspheming Eros. Then Socrates continues his speech. Now, some people, it's called in philosophy, philosophers refer to it as the great speech. You don't even have to say the great speech from Phaedrus. If you just say the great speech, everybody knows you're talking about this speech, right? It's just called the great speech. I think, though, my idiosyncratic reading of it, that is not actually a second speech. It's just a continuation of the first speech. Like Phaedrus said, you stopped right in the middle. You just got started, and Socrates says, all right, I'm going to continue with the speech that I was giving. And so the great speech is actually a continuation of that speech that he was giving before, which is why we're looking at the whole thing. So much important stuff happens in the great speech. This is where Socrates gives his definition of the soul. In fact, his definition of the whole soul, as I mentioned before when we were talking about the whole soul, the little soul, the psycherion, in chapter 9, right, in between lost and found, the metaxy, and we've looked at that term, the psycherion, the little soul, which is the term that he used in the Allegory of the Cave, which we talked about in chapter 8, the upward journey of the little soul, right? Here he gives a definition of the whole soul. So we'll shift and look at his language of the whole soul, the whole psyche. He also gives this famous allegory of the chariot, which I mentioned way back in chapter 1, right? I was giving an overview. Maybe you remember that whole discussion about the chariot and the horse of logic and the horse of desire and the charioteer that's trying to control these two, right? Philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for wisdom through inspiration. That's what this text is all about, right? So he gives his tripartite soul, the allegory of the chariot there in the great speech. In other words, the great speech kind of shows us how to inspire a soul with a desire for wisdom. So that's part of why we're looking at it. Philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for wisdom through inspiration. Then the second half, right? Now we're up to the second half. We're not going to read the second half. We're going to read all the rest of this. And by read, I mean, some reading and then some. I've recorded some of these. Maybe I'll try and, I haven't recorded the great speech, but that's my goal, is to try and get it there, get that up soon. But you can either read the text or you can watch the videos or you can do both. The videos are just performances or readings of the text itself. But we're not going to look at the second half except for right now. So I'll just give you a kind of an overview of what's in that second half. This is important. This whole thing works as one complete dialogue, right? And the second half is very different from the first half. The second half, there's no speeches. They just lay down, Socrates and Phaedrus lay on the grass in the afternoon underneath the shade of this plane tree, and they just talk about the distinction between logic and rhetoric. They're mostly talking about rhetoric, but they're talking about, the relationship between logic, rhetoric, and truth, right? And in this, Socrates says he uses a number of comparisons. One is he compares rhetoric to being skilled with rhetoric to a medical doctor, right? So he's talking about those who are skilled with rhetoric are kind of like those who are skilled with medicine, right? Doctors. But he said, just because you're a doctor, like a medical doctor, in order to be a medical doctor, a good medical doctor, you've got to understand pharmaceuticals, right? You've got to understand the chemicals and the medicines and the treatments and all those kind of things. What do these chemicals do? What do these potions do, right? What do they do? How do they affect the human body? But just because you know those things, just because you're a pharmacist, doesn't mean you're a good doctor, right? In order to be a good doctor, you've got to know the medicines, but you also got to know how to use those medicines and when to use them and how to use them, right? And your goal in that is to heal the soul. But if you know the medicines, if you know these potions, then you can also use those potions, right, to make people sick or to harm people or to poison people. Right? So the same way with rhetoric, right? Rhetoric is a tool that speaks to the soul, and it can be used to harm as well as to heal. In the same way that a medical doctor uses pharmakon, which is the Greek, word pharmaceutical comes straight from that word. In the same way that a medical doctor uses pharmakon to heal the body, someone skilled in rhetoric can use dialogue or talk therapy, right, to heal the soul. However, knowing what a particular pharmakon or potion doesn't make you a medical doctor, because a medical doctor needs to diagnose each patient and to figure out what treatment needs to be applied and how to apply it in that particular case, right? This is all the things that Socrates says, second half of that dialogue. He says, likewise, being skilled in rhetoric does not mean that, may mean that you can write good speeches, but that's different than healing the soul, right? Because to heal the soul, you've got to diagnose each individual patient. Everybody has different issues with their heart and with their soul, and so you've got to talk to those people, listen to those people, right? Diagnose each patient and know how to apply those skills with rhetoric in that particular case in a way that will heal that particular patient, right? So in the same, we've talked about before that logic is a tool, right? I mentioned Plato's dialogue with Meno, where he compares logic to a knife, right? And a knife you can use in lots of different ways. He mentions 4 in particular. We've gone over these a few times, but it's worth repeating again, right? You can use a knife in order to cut food to prepare a meal for yourself. You can also use the same knife to cut food to prepare a meal for somebody who's hungry. And he talks a lot, that's a theme that comes up frequently in the Phaedrus dialogue, is about feeding the hungry, taking care of those who are hungry, taking care of those who are sick, right? So using this tool in order to take care of those who are sick. But you can also use a knife to stab somebody in the back, right? You can use a knife to harm. You can use a knife to oppress. We talked about in chapter 9, that psycherion, the little soul, right? Every time Socrates uses that term, the little soul, which is only a handful of times, but every time it's always in reference to those who use their skills of logic and reason in order to harm, in order to oppress, in order to harm, to hurt people, right? There's those little souls. They're the ones in the cave, right, that are keeping those people distracted, that are keeping those prisoners in the cave, because as long as they're paying attention to those screens, right, then the people that are controlling those, the content creators and whatnot, can control those people as long as they can control their attention, right? So in the same way, you can use a knife to prepare food for yourself. You can use a knife to prepare food for somebody who's hungry. You can use a knife to stab somebody in the back, or you can use a knife to liberate, right? To cut the binds that are holding someone else back. Likewise with rhetoric. Rhetoric is a tool that can be used in all of those ways just as well, right? As we'll see in a minute, Lysias, who's this character that's sort of off stage, he's very much like this psycherion, right? A little soul who's using his skill, colluding sometimes with other folks like Epicretus. We'll look at him in a minute. These little souls who collude with one another to form, what we call oligarchies, another Greek word, popular in Athens at the time, right? In order to incite the mob, and in order to oppress, in order to control people, right? Particularly the mob. In the same way that a pharmacon is a potion that can either heal or poison a physical body, rhetoric is something that can inspire the soul, inspire a psyche, inspire this mind soul to do something that is good, or rhetoric can be used to incite people to do something that is bad. Now, the real life Phaedrus, these are all real people. This is a fictional dialogue. It's a fictional dialogue involving real people from Athens. And Phaedrus was a real person who, as it turned out, was part of a mob that was incited by some politicians to vandalize parts of the city in Athens. So we'll look at that right now, right? So let's look at these. That's done with the introduction to the text and the overview of its structure. Now let's look at some of the characters and dates. As I mentioned, this is a dialogue with only two dialogue partners, Socrates and Phaedrus. Socrates, as we know, died in 399. He was murdered by the government. Phaedrus was a bit younger, but Phaedrus was somebody who was exiled. He committed a crime and he was exiled. He presumably committed the crime. He was at least convicted of the crime. Whether or not he did it seems like he did. But anyway, he, as a punishment for the crime, he was exiled from the city of Athens for some time, from the year 415 until the year 403 BCE. Then we've got this other guy, Lysias. And let's look at a passage from the text right at the beginning of the text. He says, "Phaedrus, my friend." Socrates says, "Phaedrus, my friend, where have you been, and where are you going?" Where are you going? We'll see, right? That Socrates may have something to say about where he's going, but he said, "Where have you been?" Phaedrus says, "I was with Lysias, the son of Cephalus, which is the Republic dialogue, right? Which is where the allegory of the cave comes from. The Republic. The Republic is set in the house of Cephalus, so it's set in the house of Lysias's father. Cephalus, by the way, may be relevant here. Cephalus was a wealthy older man, and he made his wealth by he was a shield producer, right? So he made shields for the army. So made his wealth off of war. Socrates says, "So Lysias, I take it, was in the city?" And Phaedrus says, "Yes, he's at the house of Epicretus, which used to belong to Morychus." Now this is another one of those lines, right? There's so many lines in here, especially in the preamble, that just seem like little throwaway, like little chit-chat dialogue lines. Turn out to have quite a bit of meaning. So who is Lysias? Well, Lysias was a famous, wealthy speech writer. So he wrote speeches for politicians. He also wrote speeches for the way that they had the courts. You would go in front of a large crowd and give your defense, give your apologia, your apology, your defense for whatever you did, right? You present your defense, but you do so in front of a large crowd. And so Lysias would write these speeches for people to give those defenses. And Lysias is at the house of Epicretus. Who is Epicretus? So Epicretus, there's no other way to say it. Epicretus was a bad dude. He was a bad guy. He was notoriously corrupt. In fact, he was brought up on corruption charges a couple of times. First time he was convicted, but faced no punishment because he basically just bought his way out of it. And then the second time he was brought up on corruption charges, he basically admitted, I embezzled all these funds from the city, but then he just shared those, give kickbacks and bribes and whatever, and got off on that too. So he's somebody he's kind of a slippery character, right? He's a corrupt politician, and Lysias is at his house, presumably in order to write some defense, right? So it matters, right, that Lysias, someone who writes speeches for politicians and criminals, is at the house that Phaedrus just came from, right, which Lysias is at, which is filled with a criminal, right? But what about this other guy, Morychus? So Morychus, there's this phrase. It's kind of a little joke. It is a joke, right? But in Greek, there's this little joke. Moroteros Morychus. Moroteros Morychus, or Morychus. Which means it's just a sort of an idiom. It's like people say this thing like Moroteros Morychus, which means sillier than Morychus. Who's Morychus? Well, so Morychus was this guy's name, right? But it's also a reference to Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of wine, is the god of partying and that kind of stuff, right? And he has lots of different names, and one of his names is Morychus, but it's a name given to this particular statue of Dionysus on the island of Sicily, right? Just off the boot of Italy, right? The big island of Sicily. Quite a drive, or quite a boat ride, I guess you'd say, from Greece. But this little statue of Dionysus there, and Dionysus is somebody. The statue is outside of the temple, and they say, Moroteros Morychus, sillier than Morychus, because he sits outside. He's always concerned with like external material things, like partying. He's a party guy, right? He's concerned with partying and good times and that kind of stuff, to the neglect of what's inside, right? That's the joke, or say those people are sillier than, when people get drunk, they do dumb things, right? And it's bad for their internal soul and that kind of stuff, but they do silly things. And so that's kind of the joke, right? But there's another layer. There's a lot of other layers to it. One is that at the time when this is set, the year 415 BCE, Athens was about to invade Sicily, right? And so Morychus, this guy who used to own the house that Epicretus, the crook, who's a politician, who's behind, part of this invasion of Sicily and everything, he's taken his house, right? He's stolen the house that used to belong to Morychus, who's in Sicily. So he's taken his house, and now they're going to invade Sicily, right? So then you can just take his house because you're invading it, right? So this is a war, basically a war. There's a lot of different layers to this particular battle. I don't want to like oversimplify it or anything like that, but basically they're going to war. They're invading Sicily, in part because this other politician named Alcibiades. Alcibiades is an important character, is a student of Socrates, is an important politician. There's a Platonic dialogue called Alcibiades, which is, Alcibiades was also at the symposium. He was in the Republic. He's all over the place, right? He's an important guy. We don't need to worry too much about him right now. But he gave this speech to the people of Athens and said, all right, we need to go. The claim, at least, was there's some people in Sicily who are being oppressed, and by the people that are there, we need to go defend them, right, by invading the country. So they went and invaded the country in order to save this small group of people, supposedly, right? But really what they're going after is what all wars are about, right? Money. And so that they can kill the men, steal their possessions, take women and children as slaves and bring them back. But also Alcibiades, he's a general, he's a military leader, he's a shrewd guy, he's a smart guy, maybe a good guy, maybe he's a complex guy, right? But one of the things that he really wanted from Sicily is the wood, the timber, the trees. And trees play an important role in this dialogue between Phaedrus and Socrates. But he wants the Sicilian wood so that they can make more boats for their navy, right? The Sicilian timber there is good for building a navy. So here's another detail, important little detail, right? On June 7th, 415, something happened, right? The mob got drunk. They around 3 o'clock in the morning. So they went to the theater of Dionysus. They've been drinking all night. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever, and this mob goes there, and they decide to go. They decide to go and deface all these statues. They start defacing all these statues. I'm going to show a little video clip that I recorded from that game, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is set in this time in Greece at this time. And you can see the theater of Dionysus. But also these statues, these Hermai. So Hermai were all over the city, right? These statues of Hermes, but they were these rectangular columns. As we'll see, in the great speech, Socrates gives an important discussion about sculpture and carvings and that sort of thing, and taking away the anyway, we'll get to that later. But the statues matter for a number of reasons, right? And so there's these rectangular columns, stone columns, and all they have a head of Hermes on the top, with these big eyes, and the eyes are important. It's important to be seen by Hermes. So the idea is that you want to be seen by Hermes. You want to be seen by one of these Hermai statues anytime you step foot out of the city. Now remember, well, we haven't gotten to that yet, but this dialogue takes place outside of the city, takes place out in nature, right? They have to leave the city. That's part of what they do in the preamble, is they leave the walls of the city and they go out into nature outside of the city. And anytime you step foot outside of the city, you're supposed to be seen by Hermes. And the idea is that you've got like a spirit that's watching over you anytime you leave the city, right? So you want to be seen by the Hermai so that when you leave, then they can watch over you and that sort of thing, right? But this mob, this drunk mob at 3 o'clock in the morning on June 7th, 415 BCE, they go around and they start defacing these statues, really just focusing on the eyes. They start like destroying the eyes so that they can't see you, and they also destroy the phalluses and these penises and on the statues, the weird kind of statues. Also kind of relevant for this text, as we'll see later. But the idea apparently, what was in the mind of this mob, it's hard to know what was in the mind of the mob, but maybe what they were thinking was, all right, we don't want this war to happen. We don't want our troops going abroad in order to invade Sicily. We don't need any more war and all that kind of stuff. It seems like a war of aggression, a war of profit. We're against the war, right? Some people were against the war. And so their thinking was, if they destroyed the eyes of these Hermes statues, these Hermai, then maybe the troops will say, well, we're not going to leave, right? Because we won't be protected. It's a bad omen. It's a bad thing that happens. We can't leave if we can't be seen by these Hermai, so that it will cancel the war. Of course, that's not what happened, right? They still invaded. They still had the war. It was kind of a mess, but anyway, it still happened, right? But so some people just thought, well, I think most people just thought, just a bunch of drunk young men who got drunk, and like people do, right? You get Morychus. When you get drunk, you get sillier than Dionysus, right? And you neglect important things, and you make bad decisions when you're in that altered state of mind. And so most people just thought that's what it was. But then there were some people, maybe Socrates was one of them, who thought that there were some politicians who were behind it. Maybe people like Epicretus, who saw this as an opportunity to try to use the mob and incite the mob in order to do something that would harm the city, in order to advance whatever political agenda that they had at the time, right? That they could use the mob to incite violence against the state, against the people of Athens, against these statues and these monuments and the things that represented important things to the people of Athens, in order to advance their own selfish political interests. So this seems to be what Socrates thought, and seems to be what a lot of folks thought. But who really knows? But one of the things that we looked at in the previous chapter on theory, right, ways of seeing, we talked about did a phenomenology of spirit, and alcohol is an important spirit, or we use the word spirit and spirits to refer to alcoholic spirits, right, because they affect the body. When you drink a lot of spirits, then you become Morychus. You become silly. You become sillier than Morychus, and you do all these sort of dumb things, right? You make bad decisions when you're in that altered state of mind, right? Because alcohol is a kind of spirit that affects decision making, usually negatively, right? Last but not least, one more detail to mention. Phaedrus was part of that mob. So or at least convicted of being part of that mob, right? He was convicted. That was the crime that he committed, the crime that caused him to be exiled from the city. If he was one of those drunk men that night, or at least accused of being one of those drunk men that night, and was exiled from the city of Athens as punishment. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this section, characters and dates. Let's talk about the physical setting of this dialogue. I've already mentioned it a couple of times, but it's important, just why. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. In fact, the title of this chapter, as I mentioned, is called Out of Place. Phaedrus at one point says to Socrates, he says, you look totally out of place out here, right? He uses the Greek word atipotatos, or as my son, I want my kids to learn Greek and study this text as well. And so when we were studying it together, I wanted him to learn that Greek word atipotatos, and my son was like, "Yeah, got it. Out of potatoes."
You've really been the most marvelous guide, my dear Phaedrus. And you, my remarkable friend, appear to be totally out of place.
So Socrates thinks that the absolute best place to have any philosophical dialogue or discussion is in the agora. The agora is the marketplace, right? That's where all the people are. And why does he think that? Because he thinks that the only way for a democracy to survive and democracy to function well is if everybody in the community, everybody in the city, everybody in the demos is well educated, right? So you need to get everybody involved in that discussion of justice, as we saw at the beginning of the Republic dialogue, as I mentioned, right? It begins with the phenomenology of justice. What do you think justice is? What do you think justice is? What do you think justice is? We got to get all voices involved, right? Hearing one another into speech. Do a phenomenology of justice because everybody's voice matters. We've got to hear what everybody thinks, right? So the best place to do that is to have these philosophical discussions in the agora, in the marketplace, where everybody is, where everybody goes, right? So that anybody can join this discussion. Anybody can be a part of it, right? Anybody can be a part of the dialogue. So he thought it was critically important to do that, so because it was important for every soul, the hole suke, to be to participate in the discourse. Now, apparently, at least according to Socrates, the only time that he ever set foot out of the city, besides this time when he goes out with Phaedrus, when he follows Phaedrus out. So Phaedrus is the one leading him out, and he follows where Phaedrus leads, right? Dangling those leaves of a book, right? Because that's what Socrates desires. But it turns out it's not really the pages of the book that Socrates desires, but he wants to inspire, he wants to save, he wants to rescue, right? He has pathos for Phaedrus, and he wants to save him or rescue him. That's why he follows him out. But he says that the only time he's ever stepped foot out of the city of Athens besides this time was when he was serving in the military, right? So he was a military soldier, and then he was sent abroad for war and those kind of things. Other than that, he says, I always keep to the city. The city is where I like to be. But in this dialogue, Socrates and Phaedrus walk in a stream outside of the city, the Lysias, which is really more of a stream than a river. And so they just walk, they even walk in the stream, right, and talk about how it feels on the cool water on their feet on this hot day and that kind of stuff. And they sit under a shade tree, a plane tree, which is also an important detail, which we'll get to when we get there. Let's look at this passage, 230c. Phaedrus says, "And you, my remarkable friend, appear to be totally out of place. Atipotatos. Really, just as you say,
you seem to need a guide, not to be one of the locals. Not only do you never travel abroad, but as far as I can tell, you've never even set foot
beyond the city walls, right? Remember, in order to step foot outside of the city walls, you got to be seen by the Herm. So that's also a reference to this whole June 7th, 415 insurrection kind of thing. So the fact that this dialogue is set in nature is very important. I think it's fair to say, in fact, that nature is kind of another dialogue partner. It's almost like another character in this dialogue. There's the heat of the sun. He says that there's the songs of the cicadas. Layers. He mentions cicadas at least 3 or 4 times throughout the dialogue. A few times in the first half, and then a couple times in the second half. And he says the cicadas are like, the ancestors singing to us. They're muses that inspire us, and that sort of. So cicadas that are the ancestors that are watching over us and seeing what are we doing, right? Are we going the way of immortality, or are we just doing whatever is good for us in the moment, right?
Freshness of the air, how pretty and pleasant it is, how it echoes with the summery, sweet song of the cicadas' chorus.
So the water under their feet, the wind on their faces is also, the wind is also an important character in this dialogue. The wind, the Boreas, the north wind that that protects the city of Athens. In fact, the north wind is when the Persians came and invaded the city with their huge navy and everything, there was a huge gust of wind, the Boreas, the north wind came in and it blew all their ships into the rocks, right? So the city of Athens was protected by the wind, and Socrates mentions that a couple of times here, the role that the wind plays in this dialogue. Like I said, nature is really a character. It's really playing an important role in this particular text, which is super unusual, super, right, idiosyncratic in terms of Plato's dialogues, which don't usually take place in nature, or where nature doesn't usually play such a big part. As you'll notice when we read the text, the spirits in nature, the nymphs and everything, these spirits inspire Socrates. The cicadas are like the muses that inspire him, just as they've inspired poets and many other artists before him. So, speaking of poets and artists before him, that brings us to this next section. Let's talk about Pindar. So I gotta say, I've been studying this text, like I said, for 15 years, and every time I read it, I find something new. Every time I read a journal article or a book about it or something, find something, learn something that just blew my mind. But nothing even compares to what I learned just a couple of months ago when I was preparing for this course, doing more research on the Phaedrus dialogue. Is it was good to keep learning more and more about these texts. And I read this article by a professor at Penn State University named Dr. Christopher Moore, and he wrote this. When I was reading it, this line just really kind of stuck out to me. It's like, all right, I want to kind of go and find out, what the hell's going on here. Socrates, right at the beginning, Phaedrus says, it's still in the preamble, Phaedrus says, you'll hear all about it if you're free to come along and listen, right, to this speech. Socrates says, what? Don't you think I would consider it, quote, more important than the most pressing engagement, as Pindar says, to hear how you and Lysias spent this time?
You'll hear all about it if you're free to come along and listen. What? Don't you think I would consider it the most important and most pressing engagement, as Pindar says, to hear how you and Lysias spent your time?
Right. Now, the first 150 times or so that I read this text, I just didn't really pay much attention to that line. But then, I read this this article by Christopher Moore at Penn State that blew my mind, gave me a whole new perspective on the Phaedrus, and a perspective that is absolutely relevant to our course, this philosophical quest that we're on right now. So step 3, remember step 3 of the phenomenological method? Listen to the experts. So let's listen to this guy. He's an expert, Christopher Moore. Let's listen to him. And so he wrote this article, I think it was 2014, 15, something like that, when he published it. And he said, so he wrote about Pindar. So now let's talk about Pindar. So Pindar wrote this ode to, so Pindar is from another city, the city of Thebes, which is kind of a rival of, there's definitely a big rivalry going on between Thebes and Athens. It's really long and complex and all that kind of stuff. Pindar is from Thebes. And one important thing about Thebes was they had this, what made Thebes famous and successful, one of the things that made them successful in war was this sacred band, what's called the sacred band. It was an army, sort of a super elite force of 300 soldiers. And they were in these pairs, 150 pairs of lovers and beloved. It was usually an older man and a younger man that went off in these pairs in war. So the lover and the beloved, and they watched out after each other and they worked together. It was like mentor and mentee, right? So this sacred band was super close to one another, and they basically just kicked everybody's ass everywhere they went. But, more on that another time, perhaps. Right now, I want to talk about this poem that Pindar wrote about this kid named Herodotus. So Herodotus, also from Thebes. There's a lot of folks named Herodotus, but we're talking about this guy that, you wouldn't really know anything about him other than this poem that Pindar wrote about him. So, and Pindar wrote this text, this ode to Herodotus, sometime around 458 BC, so quite a while before any of this kind of stuff happened, but not that long. All right, let's talk about this. So, why is it important? Basically, there's this local boy, right, Herodotus, from Thebes, and he goes off and he wins a gold medal in the Olympics. Big whoop, right? What are we talking about? So he went off and he won a gold medal in the Olympics. And then somebody writes to Pindar and says, dude, this other kid from Thebes, he won a gold medal. We want to do what you do, right? Which is have a parade, right? If the Red Sox win the World Series, have a parade in Boston, right? You have a parade to celebrate that win. Everybody goes and it's exciting and party and all that kind of stuff. And if somebody wins a gold medal like this and you have a day to honor that person, you celebrate that person. Why? Woo-hoo! It's important, right? And it's important. And Pindar knows it's important because those people inspire the youth, right? If the youth see this guy Herodotus, he did something awesome and he's just like you. He's from right down the street, right? If he can do it, you can do it. How did he do it? By being excellent, by working his ass off, by working really hard, by being diligent, all those kind of things, right? And then so other young people see that older person who's done something excellence, right? Done something excellent, arete, excellence. We've used that word arete a lot. I keep trying to teach you that word, and every time I do, I keep giving you like a different meaning to it, and it has lots of different meanings. It means excellence. It also means skill, right? Being skillful, being excellent. But Socrates takes it and uses it to mean virtue, right? He writes an ode to virtue, being good, right? Being excellent, in fact, arete even kind of becomes one of the forms, right? So you've got justice, goodness, beauty, truth maybe, and arete, or virtue. So it becomes one of the forms. So that anyway, Pindar wrote this ode to excellence, this ode to Pindar, in order to inspire the youth of Thebes, right? So that's not all, right? So Herodotus won due to his excellence, his arete, his hard work, his discipline, his self-control, his diligent training, and because of his passionate desire that drove him to work twice as hard, even especially work twice as hard on those days where you didn't really feel like getting out of bed, right? We all have those days, but it's that desire for something more meaningful, for something higher, for some higher purpose, some existential drive that causes us to get out of bed even when we don't want to, right? That desire for excellence, arete, that would not only make mommy and daddy proud, but also make the entire hometown proud, make the youth proud, right? And inspire them to do something else, right? So why is it important for Pindar, another hometown hero, to do this? Because he wanted to inspire the young people in his town for a desire, to inspire them with a desire for excellence, right? If they can do it, maybe I can do it too. So stories of inspiration help us to believe in ourselves. In other words, Pindar wants to immortalize this hero. I mean, it worked, right? We're talking about him in 2022. We're still talking about him, right? So in some ways, he's not like all the other folks in Thebes, right? But we're still talking about him today. He's immortalized that hero so that others will be inspired by the spiritual force that pushed him towards excellent, right? In order to get out of the cave, you've got to have some sort of spiritual force. In chapter 9, in between Lost and Found, we talked about the discourse between Socrates and Diotima, where she talks about Eros, that erotic desire is a spiritual force. It's in between mortal and immortal. It's that drive, that force of nature that drives us. At the most basic level, it drives us towards intercourse, right? Sexual intercourse with human bodies, that inborn desire that we have to get freaky, right? But then that force, as we saw in that chapter, in that discussion between Diotima and Socrates, she says, you can climb that ladder of desire. That desire for human bodies can become a desire for psyche, for discourse, right? Not just for intercourse with bodies, but for discourse with other minds and other souls. And even that can be transcended to become a desire for laws that ensure the freedom, justice, and equality of all those minds and bodies in society, right? So we desire those laws because we have some sort of existential desire, existential drive, existential desire for justice, for goodness, for wisdom. Philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for wisdom through inspiration. We got it all right here in this ode that Pindar writes on behalf of Herodotus of Thebes, right? So inspiring a desire for justice through Eros, that great spirit that's in between mortal and immortal. Now, already that seems super significant, right? So thank you, Professor Moore, for sort of bringing all that to our attention. But that's not even what totally blew my mind, right? What totally blew my mind is this guy Herodotus. So I told you he won the gold medal in the Olympics. Guess what he won the gold medal in the Olympics for? He was a charioteer. He drove a chariot in the race, right? So he was a charioteer. I've already given you way back in chapter 1, right? The tripartite soul, which comes from this text, right? Intellect is the charioteer, which makes decisions guided by these two horses, right? The horse of logic and reason, which we talked about a couple of chapters, right? In chapter 6 and 7, but also that horse of desire, that ladder of desire that Diotima talked about, that I just went over, right? So he's a chariot driver, he's a charioteer, but that's not all. There's more to it than that. As Pindar tells us in this ode, right, one of the things that makes Herodotus excellent is not just that he won the gold medal for chariot driving in the Olympics, but that he both trained the horses and he drove the horses. Now, this was unusual, right? Usually you have somebody who trains the horses, somebody like Bob Baffert, right, who trains the horses and maybe gives them steroids or something like that. But somebody who trains the horses, right, who's an expert, who's that sort of intellectual, who trains, who that sort of thing. But then you've also got a jockey, right? Somebody who is just the driver, who's just the professional jockey or whatever. But Herodotus did both. He trained his own horses and he drove his own chariot, and he won the gold medal, right? Super excellent. But if that's not enough to blow my mind, which it is, it turns out that Pindar's ode to Herodotus, his ode to excellence, follows Socrates' great speech, aligns with the structure and everything, the content, and so many, as Dr. Moore points out, there's so many similarities between these two, right? The parallels are impossible to overlook once you see them, right? Which we can see through the work of this experts on Plato. So there is so much more to say about this, and maybe I'm already overwhelming you, and maybe this is already running long, but it's got a lot more to say, right? So we'll pause, and I want to start putting all of these pieces together, right? Not just putting all these pieces that I've given you today together, but start putting all of this in the context of our philosophical quest. How does it fit together with all of these other things? I've done some of that, but I want to make it even more explicit now, right? By putting this text into context and metanoia. So in chapter 8, right, we talked about chapter 8, the title of chapter 8 is the upward journey of the little soul, the psycharion that goes on this upward journey to get out of the cave, right? And as Socrates points out, I emphasized this quite a bit when we were talking about the upward journey of the little soul. Hopefully I emphasized it enough, that there are two metanoias, right? Metanoia is that turning around, that conversion, that turning around. He says there needs to be a metanoia of the whole body. You can't turn the eyes without turning the whole body. You can't turn the soul without turning the whole soul, right? So the metanoia of the whole suke, the whole soul. And that's what education is, right? Not putting sight into blind eyes, but turning them around so that they can see the truth, right? An uncovering, aletheia of the truth, of the things themselves, right? To see the puppeteers behind these puppets, right? So there's two metanoias. There's one metanoia when this when this poor soul, this prisoner in the cave, has to turn around from the screens that they're watching, from the shadows on the wall, right, in order to get out of the cave. But then Socrates emphasizes that there must be another metanoia. Glaucon has trouble understanding this. Glaucon says, he says, this person who gets out of the cave, notice I've drawn this little stick figure, if you can see it, facing back into the cave, right? He's already had this metanoia. Socrates says to Glaucon, each of you must go in turn,
must go down
to dwell
the cave,
in the cave
and live in the cave, in the common dwelling place of the others, and grow accustomed to seeing in the dark.
And let your eyes adjust to the darkness. Why? Because, remember, we spent a good deal of time on the very first sentence of the Allegory of the Cave. As we saw, right, there's two metanoias, turning away from the screens by turning towards the things themselves. But his main point was that second metanoia. He says, each of you must go down to live in the cave, Republic 520c. Why? Because, that first sentence, because you care, pathos, right? Because there must be some pathos, because you care about the well-being of every member of society in order to turn the hole suke, the whole soul, because we only get out of the cave together. Now, Glaucon understood the prisoner part of the cave allegory, right? He understood why we'd want to turn these people around, or why they'd want to turn around, but he had trouble understanding, why would you go back in?
Well, but don't we do those teachers an injustice by making them live a worse life when they could live a better one?
Right? He struggled to understand why we must go down to live in the cave. And most people do. If you watch almost any YouTube video on the Allegory of the Cave, no one really talks about that part, right? That whole emphatic speech that Socrates gives at the end, where he says, each of you must go down in turn to live in the cave, right? We've made you kings. We've made you leaders of the swarm, right? You have a responsibility to take the education that we've given you, that we've raised you up in this city. You've got a responsibility to do likewise, right? And go and liberate every person in the cave. So we spent a lot of time focusing on that first sentence of the cave allegory. And in that first sentence, right, Socrates tells us that the point of the allegory is to contrast the effect of educating a child, paideus, versus the lack of formal education, apaideusis. The difference between those two things on our emotional state of mind, right? The outer side ring of that systematic philosophy, right? Emotions and states of mind. That's where we're talking about a lot these days, right? So these getting drunk, right? Being in a drunk state of mind leads to making certain kinds of decisions, right? So does getting stoned or whatever. Lots of different sort of spirits can inhabit us or can occupy our bodies, which lead us to make certain kinds of decisions. But those spirits aren't necessarily from substances that affect our body, but also words that affect our minds, right? But if we have that paideus, that if we raise these little children right, then it will affect their emotional states of mind so that they will have a pathos. They will care. They won't be apathetic to the injustices of other people in society, but they will be pathos. They will have feeling, right? Strong feeling. They will care about those people. If a person has had a glimpse, Socrates, if a person has had a glimpse of justice itself, represented by the unchanging, the really real sun, then they will not be apathetic, but will have feelings or pathos for those who are trapped in mental prisons and being controlled by those little souls who continue to deceive them by telling them what to think, right? What to care about and what to pay attention to. So what the cave allegory does not tell us, is about this other metanoia. How do we do that? Right? He said the whole point of the metanoia of the allegory is, all right, you've got to have metanoia, you've got to get out of the cave. Once you get out of the cave, you got to go back in. But he doesn't say, all right, once you get down there, once your eyes have adjusted, How do you cause that other metanoia? How do you liberate those prisoners in the cave, right? That's why we're reading Phaedrus dialogue, because it shows us how to liberate those minds and souls, right? This liberative philosophy of liberating those souls. To explain, right? Just to explain, start putting these pieces together. We've got three main characters in this dialogue. Most people say there's two, but there's two dialogue partners. There's two bodies there. There's Socrates and Phaedrus. But then there's also that invisible character, that character that Socrates at one point says, as long as Lysias himself is present, but he's not present in body, he's only present in words. The words that Phaedrus is so inspired by, that is so overwhelmed by, so enamored by, right? He's really enamored by this speech that Lysias, right? That speechwriter who writes speeches and defends people like Epicretus, the corrupt politician, right, in order to defraud people and take advantage and steal and corruption and all those kind of things, right? So Phaedrus is being manipulated or controlled or incited by the words of Lysias, who's not there. And it's important, I think, that Lysias is sort of invisible. He can't be seen here, right? His words go without saying, to quote Jacques Derrida, this other philosopher who makes a big deal of that point as well. His words go without saying, but then they are said by Phaedrus, right? So you've got these three characters here: Socrates, Phaedrus, and Lysias. And Lysias is the puppeteer, and Phaedrus is the one that's, oh, look at all these shadows on the wall. Aren't these shadows on the wall super awesome, right? Socrates, don't you think it's awesome? And Socrates is like, I don't know, maybe we should look at it. Now, another point, Socrates repeatedly in this dialogue refers to Phaedrus as Pai, P-A-I, which is like an affectionate term, which just means like child, right? Like you would call your own child Pai. So an affectionate term, right, meaning child. So he keeps calling him child. Now, he's not a child in that sort of sense, right? Not in terms of age. He's a young man at this point. But he's a child because he's being deceived. He's being manipulated by Lysias, and he doesn't realize it. But Socrates doesn't just come out and say, dude, this guy's obviously taking advantage of you. Wake up, right? He doesn't just say, you got to wake up, like Bink said in that video, right? But instead, he's much more gentle, right? He comes at it a particular way. So, of course, is Socrates the liberated teacher who wants to turn Phaedrus around, to lead him out of the mental cave that Lysias has imprisoned him in. And Lysias is obviously the Psycharion, right? The little soul that we talked about in chapter 8, but especially in chapter 9, when we look closely at that term, right? Those little souls are those people who are very clever. They're very smart. They use logic and rhetoric in order to get what they want, right? And to play on people's desires, to dangle what they want in front of them, to lead them wherever they want them to go, right? So Lysias is one of those little souls who uses his skill, arete, not for excellence, arete, or virtue, arete, but uses his skill, arete, in order to control innocent souls like Phaedrus and to enrich and empower himself and other corrupt leaders, corrupt little souls like Epicretus, right? These little souls work together often in what we call oligarchy. So it's significant, I think, that Lysias is present in the form of the speech, but invisible in the dialogue, just like the captors in the cave allegory, right? They're present but invisible. Sees only the shadows of Lysias's artifact, the artifact of his speech. How? So then how? How does Socrates liberate this this child, right? How does he turn him around? Well, he does so through psychological healing, right? For that, we're going to really have to look at the text. So I'm not going to do too much of that now, but as we read the text and as we pay attention, Pay careful attention to how Socrates liberates, how Socrates turns Phaedrus around, how he inspires him with a desire for wisdom and for truth and for justice and for beauty and for excellence, or arete in that other sense, right? First, let me just give you a little overview, right, of how he does it. So we're going to look in detail when we get into the text, but I'm almost out of time because I want to keep this to an hour and 15. I'm going to keep this under an hour and 15 minutes. Doing good so far. Doing well so far. First, Socrates follows Phaedrus. First, you have to go down into the cave, right? Each of you must in turn go down into the cave. Follow that person. He follows Phaedrus. He says, Phaedrus says, lead the way. And Phaedrus says, no. You lead the way. I'll follow you, right? So Phaedrus tries to get him to lead, but Socrates says, no, I will follow you, right? Socrates follows him into the cave, and there Socrates is totally out of place. He's atapotetos. He's totally out of place here. Next, Socrates continues to, he praises him, he encourages him, he builds up his confidence, he points out all the things that he's doing well. You delivered that speech, you delivered the hell out of that speech, boy. You did a great job, right? That speech was terrible, but you did a great job of reading that terrible speech, right? It's a miracle, my friend. I'm in ecstasy, and it's all your doing, Phaedrus. I was looking at you while you were reading, and it seemed to me the speech had made you radiant with delight. He listens to him, not only in the speech, but also in the dialogue. He hears him into speech. That Nell Morton quote that I just can't erase from here, right? Hearing one another into speech through listening, right? Through silence, those pregnant pauses where we listen to our neighbor and hear them into speech. Why? Because speaking, being heard, is something healing, right? There's an aspect of when somebody sees you as you are, right, being yourself, when you're able to be yourself. In some places we're not able to be ourselves, as we discussed before, but when you are able to be yourself and people see you as you are and accept you as you are and love you as you are, that's healing, right? When people listen to you and hear your voice and hear your perspective, then that also is healing, right? It gives us it's psychologically healing, right? Listening is a critically important part of psychological healing. Everybody wants their voice to be heard, but it's not only that, right? But in order to diagnose a patient, you've got to listen to them, right? In medicine, they call it the subjective, right? Ask the patient, what's wrong, right? In order to figure out their pathology, right? Their pathos, their emotional state of mind, you have to ask them and listen to them, hear them into speech, and allow them to say what's wrong in order to diagnose the whatever is affecting their mind or their body, right? In the same way, just as a physician heals the body, Socrates heals the psyche through discourse. Most importantly, last up, Socrates inspires him. He cultivates a desire for wisdom and helps Phaedrus to climb the ladder of desire, just as Diodema helped Socrates. A true desire for wisdom is the only thing that will get anyone out of the cave. But before that desire can even begin, right? Desire is what gets you out of the cave. But before that desire can even begin, you have to have some sort of desire to turn around. So that's what starts it. What's the spark? The spark of desire that sets the whole thing in motion, right? So this is what we see here, that a true desire for wisdom is the only thing that gets one out of the cave. But before that desire can begin, this child, Pei, must experience a metanoia, or a turning around, a turning away from screens, a turning away from the shadows and screens that capture our attention and keep us prisoners. So, that's it for chapter 11. That brings us to the conclusion of this introduction, this out of place. Hopefully you feel a little bit out of place after all this, right? And hopefully this introduction to this very inspiring text also inspired you with a desire to listen to what Plato is trying to say to us, because that's what we're going to do next, right? I want you to either read this text or listen to my reading of it, or both of those things, right? Or you can even read it on the screen. You got all the text on the screen. I genuinely hope that you find it as inspiring as I do, as I continue to do, even after 15 years of studying it and after hundreds of readings. And hopefully it will help you to feel atapotatos, totally out of place, and spark some sort of metanoia or a desire for wisdom, because philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of because philosophy is a mode of discourse for the sake of training the intellect by cultivating a desire for wisdom through inspiration. With that, peace out.